Kennedy Center, Washington, D.C., March 1972. Backstage in a dressing room with peeling paint and a single flickering light, Marvin Gaye sat alone. Outside, the hallway buzzed with the biggest names in soul music: Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, all waiting for their turn to perform. But in that small room, Marvin wasn't preparing. He was staring at his hands, watching them shake. He had been performing for over a decade, thousands of stages, millions of screaming fans. But something had shifted. The applause no longer reached him. The love from the audience felt like it was meant for someone else. There was a knock on the door. A stage manager poked his head in. 5 minutes, Mr. Gaye." Marvin nodded but didn't move. The door closed again. He was alone. That night, Marvin Gaye would deliver a performance that became legend. A performance so powerful that Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul herself, would refuse to follow him on stage. A performance that left Stevie Wonder speechless. A performance that made grown men cry. But what the audience didn't see, what even the other artists didn't understand, was that Marvin wasn't performing to win. He was performing to forget. The Kennedy Center concert wasn't just another show. It was part of a nationally televised special honoring black music, and every major artist from Motown and Atlantic Records had been invited. The stakes were high. The audience included senators, civil rights leaders, and music industry executives. This wasn't a venue where you could phone it in. Marvin had been struggling with the decision to perform live again. After Tammy Terrell's death 2 years earlier, he had withdrawn from the stage. The thought of performing without her, of standing under those lights and pretending to be whole when he felt shattered, was unbearable. But Berry Gordy had insisted. Motown needed Marvin to show up. The label's image depended on their biggest stars proving they were still relevant, still powerful. So Marvin agreed. Not because he wanted to, but because refusal required a strength he no longer had. In the days leading up to the concert, Marvin barely slept. He would lie awake in hotel rooms, staring at the ceiling, replaying every mistake he had ever made. Every moment he could have been kinder. Every opportunity he had wasted. Every person he had failed. His mind kept returning to a conversation he'd had with Tammy in the hospital, weeks before she died. She had looked at him with those tired eyes and said, "You're going to spend the rest of your life trying to fill the emptiness. But nothing will work. Not the music, not the applause, nothing." At the time, Marvin had dismissed it as the words of someone too sick to understand. But now, sitting in that dressing room before the show, staring at his shaking hands, he understood. She had been right. Every performance, every standing ovation, every moment of triumph, none of it touched the void inside him. The stage manager appeared again. "It's time." Marvin stood. His legs felt weak. His hands were still shaking. But he walked toward the stage anyway. As he walked down the hallway, he passed other dressing rooms. Through the doors, he could hear laughter, music, normal people doing a normal job. But Marvin didn't feel normal. He felt like an imposter. He paused at the stage entrance. From beyond the curtain, he could hear the murmur of the audience, thousands of people waiting for him to give them something. He took a breath, then another, and then he stepped through. The Kennedy Center auditorium was packed. Nearly 2,000 people in formal attire filled the seats. The stage was massive, backed by a full orchestra and a gospel choir. The lighting rig was state-of-the-art, designed to create dramatic shifts in mood and atmosphere. Backstage, Aretha Franklin stood in the wings, watching the stage being prepared for Marvin's set. She had performed earlier in the evening and had been phenomenal, as always. Her voice had filled every corner of that massive space, commanding respect and awe. But even she was curious about what Marvin would do. Diana Ross stood nearby, speaking quietly with Stevie Wonder. They had all heard rumors about Marvin's condition, whispers that he was struggling, that he might not be able to deliver. Some people wondered if he would even show up, but he did. When Marvin walked onto that stage, the applause was polite but cautious. The audience knew his hits, they knew his reputation, but they also sensed something fragile about him. He moved slowly, almost reluctantly, like a man walking toward an execution rather than a performance. He stood at the microphone for a long moment, saying nothing. The orchestra waited. The audience waited. Even the other artists backstage held their breath. and then Marvin began to sing. He opened with What's Going On, the title track from the album that had redefined soul music a year earlier. But this wasn't the studio version. This was raw, unpolished, vulnerable. Marvin's voice started quiet, almost a whisper, as if he was singing to himself rather than to an audience. The words came out slowly, each syllable weighted with meaning. Mother, mother, there's too many of you crying. In the wings, Aretha stopped mid-conversation. Something in Marvin's voice had changed. It wasn't the smooth, seductive tone he was known for. It was darker, more broken. Brother, 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 there's far too many of you dying. Marvin's eyes were closed. His hands gripped the microphone stand like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The orchestra swelled behind him, but it was his voice that dominated. Not through power or volume, but through sheer emotional weight. Diana Ross felt a chill run down her spine. She had known Marvin for years, had performed with him countless times, but she had never heard him sound like this. You know we've got to find a way to bring some love in here today. The audience was silent, absolutely silent. No coughing, no shifting in seats, just the sound of Marvin's voice cutting through the darkness. Stevie Wonder, standing backstage with his hand resting on a speaker, could feel the vibrations of Marvin's voice through the floor. He whispered to someone standing next to him, "He's not performing, he's confessing." Marvin moved through the set list with a precision that felt almost mechanical. Mercy, Mercy Me followed What's Going On, then Inner City Blues. Each song was stripped down to its emotional core. No showmanship, no elaborate choreography, just Marvin standing at the microphone, delivering each lyric like it might be his last. But it was during I Heard It Through the Grapevine that something shifted. The orchestra hit the opening notes, and the audience recognized the song immediately. It was one of Marvin's biggest hits, a track that had defined the Motown sound. People expected energy. They expected the smooth, confident Marvin they had seen on record covers and television. But that's not what they got. Marvin's voice came in low and haunted, transforming the upbeat classic into something darker. He wasn't singing about heartbreak. He was singing about betrayal, about loss, about the moment you realize that the person you trusted most has destroyed you. His voice cracked on certain words, not from lack of technique, but from the weight of what he was expressing. And instead of hiding it, instead of smoothing it over, he leaned into it. He let the audience hear the pain. In the wings, Aretha Franklin watched with her arms crossed. She had planned to go on after Marvin, to close out the evening with her own powerful set. But as she listened, as she felt the weight of what Marvin was doing, she realized something. She couldn't follow this. Nobody could. When Marvin finished I Heard It Through the Grapevine, the audience erupted. But it wasn't the polite applause of a formal event. It was visceral. People were on their feet, some with tears streaming down their faces. Senators who had sat stone-faced through earlier performances were wiping their eyes. Civil rights leaders who had seen unspeakable horrors were visibly moved. Marvin stood at the microphone, looking out at the crowd with an expression that was hard to read. Not gratitude, not pride, just exhaustion. He whispered into the microphone, "Thank you." His voice was barely audible over the applause, and then he walked off stage. Backstage, the other artists stood frozen. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. They just watched Marvin disappear down the hallway toward his dressing room. Aretha Franklin turned to the stage manager, who was preparing to announce her as the next performer. She shook her head. "I'm not going on." The stage manager looked confused. "But you're scheduled to close the show." "I don't care," Aretha said quietly. "I can't follow that. Nobody can." She wasn't being dramatic. She wasn't exaggerating. She simply understood what had just happened. Marvin hadn't given a performance. He had given something else. Something so raw and honest that anything that came after would feel like a lie. In his dressing room, Marvin sat in the same spot he had occupied before the show. The applause from the auditorium was still audible, echoing through the walls. But in that small room, it sounded distant, like something happening to someone else. He looked at his hands. They had stopped shaking during the performance, but now the trembling had returned. There was a mirror on the wall. Marvin caught his reflection and barely recognized the person staring back. The eyes were those of a stranger, someone older, someone tired. There was a knock on the door. Marvin didn't respond. The door opened anyway. Berry Gordy stepped in, followed by a few Motown executives. They were smiling, talking rapidly about how incredible the performance had been, how it would boost record sales, how it proved Marvin was still the label's most valuable asset. Marvin listened without really hearing. The words washed over him like white noise. Barry gripped Marvin's shoulder. "You did it, man. You showed them all." Marvin nodded slowly. "Yeah." But inside, he felt nothing. The performance that had moved thousands of people, that had left Aretha Franklin speechless, that had made grown men cry, had done nothing to fill the emptiness Tammy had warned him about. The applause had been loud. The praise had been genuine. But the moment it ended, the moment he stepped off that stage, the silence returned. And the silence was always louder than any applause. News of the Kennedy Center performance spread quickly. Music journalists called it one of the greatest live performances in soul music history. Critics praised Marvin's vocal control, his emotional depth, his ability to transform familiar songs into something profound. But what nobody wrote about was what happened after the show. While other artists attended the after-party, mingling with politicians and industry executives, celebrating their successful performances, Marvin went back to his hotel room. He sat by the window, looking out at the Washington, D.C. skyline, and felt the familiar weight settling over him. He had proven he could still perform, had shown that the ghost of Tammy Terrell wouldn't destroy him completely, had delivered the kind of show that would be talked about for decades, the kind of performance that made legends refuse to follow him on stage. But none of it mattered, because the thing Tammy had understood, the thing she had tried to warn him about in that hospital room, was that success couldn't save you, applause couldn't fill the void, and the voices that told you that you were worthless, that your life was meaningless, that death would be a relief, those voices didn't care how many people were on their feet cheering. They waited in the silence, and the silence always returned. Marvin pulled out a notebook and started writing. Not lyrics, just thoughts. Stream of consciousness reflections on loneliness and performance, and the strange disconnect between who people thought you were and who you actually were. At the top of the page, he wrote, "They loved what I gave them tonight, but what I gave them wasn't me. It was the ghost of someone I used to be." The Kennedy Center performance became a turning point in how people understood Marvin Gaye. Before that night, he was known as a smooth romantic singer, the Prince of Soul, the voice that could seduce and comfort. A performer who made love songs feel safe and aspirational. After that night, people saw something else. They saw the darkness beneath the surface, the pain that fueled the beauty, the cost of creating art that moved people so deeply. They realized that the smoothness had always been a mask, and that night, for a brief moment, the mask had slipped. Aretha Franklin's refusal to follow Marvin on stage became part of music lore. In interviews years later, she would say, "That night, Marvin didn't just sing, he opened a wound and showed it to everyone, and we all understood that what we were witnessing wasn't entertainment. It was something sacred, something none of us had the right to follow." Stevie Wonder described the performance as the moment when I realized that genius and suffering are not separate things. They're the same thing expressed through different channels. Marvin showed us that night what it costs to be truly great, and most of us aren't willing to pay that price. But Marvin himself rarely talked about that night. When journalists asked him about it, he would give vague answers, deflecting praise, redirecting conversations to other topics. Because for Marvin, the Kennedy Center performance wasn't a triumph. It was evidence of the very thing that haunted him. He could move thousands of people to tears, could leave legends speechless, could create moments that would be remembered for generations, but he couldn't save himself. The applause always ended. The stage always went dark. And when he returned to that dressing room, to that hotel room, to that quiet space where there were no crowds and no distractions, the emptiness was still there, waiting. In the 12 years between the Kennedy Center performance and Marvin's death in 1984, he would deliver many more performances. Some were brilliant, some were chaotic, some were barely coherent. But people who were at Kennedy Center that night in 1972 always said the same thing. They never saw Marvin reach those heights again. Not because his voice declined or his talent faded, but because that particular performance required a specific kind of pain, a vulnerability that Marvin couldn't sustain without destroying himself completely. He had given everything that night, had held nothing back, had allowed the audience to see the real person behind the carefully constructed image. And what they saw was someone drowning. The tragedy of Marvin Gaye is that his greatest artistic achievements came from his deepest suffering. The more broken he became, the more beautiful the music. The more isolated he felt, the more deeply he connected with audiences. The Kennedy Center performance was the perfect encapsulation of that paradox. A man at the peak of his artistic powers and the depths of his personal despair, creating something so profound that even legends knew they couldn't follow it. Aretha was right to walk away, because what Marvin gave that night wasn't a performance. It was a warning. This is what genius looks like. This is what it costs, and no amount of applause can ever be enough to justify the price. Today, recordings of that Kennedy Center concert are difficult to find. The performance was televised, but the footage has been lost or locked away in archives. Only audio recordings remain, and even those are incomplete. But for the people who were there, who witnessed it in person, the memory is seared into their consciousness. They remember the silence before Marvin began, the weight of his voice, the moment they realized they were witnessing something that transcended entertainment. And they remember the look on his face when he walked off stage. Not triumph, not relief, just the empty expression of someone who had given everything and still had nothing left inside. That performance made Marvin Gaye a legend, but it also confirmed what Tammy Durrell had told him in that hospital room. The emptiness can't be filled, not by music, not by applause, not by the love of thousands. And Marvin spent the rest of his life proving her right.